Hey everybody on YouTube. Today I thought I'd take out another moment to do another vintage video repair. I would like to answer a lot of the questions I've been getting about vintage video repairs, but specifically about capacitors. I'm getting a lot of people who are writing me who are just a little confused on capacitor values and are they using the right type and various different things. Alright, I have a skip field video machine I'm working on right now. This is one that was given to me, well, not actually given to me, but basically it was given to me. I went to a flea market here in Arizona and picked up this skip field machine, and I could always use an extra skip field machine, but this thing is suffering from capacitor problems. So I thought this would be a good unit to explain capacitor repairs. If you're replacing capacitors on older units like this one from the 60s, you have to look for a lot of signs for bad capacitors. First of all, testing the capacitors is always a must if you're trying to figure out if a capacitor is bad. But if you can look at a capacitor, there's a couple little signs you can look for to give you an indication that capacitors are bad. First of all, at the top of the capacitors, they'll either be blown out or bubbled real bad at the very top of the capacitor, or at the very bottom of the capacitor, they'll be blown out or leaky. Now, if you see either one of those signs, you should change out those capacitors because they're failing, or they're no good, or they're about to just explode in your face. You know, once capacitors go bad, certain sections of the video equipment will shut down, and you will know that you do need to recap these VCRs or these reel-to-reel video machines. These capacitors are 40 or 50 years old. They're like batteries, and when they dry out and all of a sudden you plug them in after a certain long period of time, you know, you could cause damage to the rest of the electronics, or they'll start leaking immediately, or they'll just, you know, blow up in your face. I've seen it in all avenues of what can happen with capacitors. Capacitors, if they're old, you will have serious problems with. If they get leaky, you'll have problems like that, them leaking over the place, or they will just short out a circuit. So, if you're looking to replace capacitors, look for the sign of leaky capacitors, either blown out at the very top, or they're leaking on the very bottom of the capacitor. If they are leaking, or they're blown up or bubbled at the very top, just automatically change them out, because they're probably no good or they're failing. So, I hope that answers your question, sort of what to look for. If you have a multimeter and you know how to test capacitors, check your capacitors first. Unsolder one lead from the circuit board and then bridge the two capacitors and see if the capacitor is correct. It has a capacitor tester indicator on some of the multimeters, and you should look for one that has a capacitor checker on it. So there's a lot of ways you can actually check the capacitor with a multimeter, or just by eyeing the capacitor and seeing if it's leaky or if it's bulged out and it's got, you know, a big bulge at the very top means they're going bad. Various different things. But now I'm getting people asking me about capacitor values. Okay, this is like I said, this is a machine from the 1960s. They used these capacitor values that were kind of oddball compared to today's capacitor standards. If you find a capacitor in one of these units that's a 50 microfarad by 25 or 50 volts. Those are, like I said, a 50 microfarad capacitor, 50 is kind of a hard capacitor to find. But you can replace it with a modern standard capacitor of a 47 microfarads. Those work just fine. Again, if it's a 50 microfarad capacitor, you could replace it with the 47 microfarad. It will do the job just fine. I had a question about that from I believe his name was Rob, who asked me about that. He was working on a similar machine, and he couldn't find the 50 microfarads. So, Rob, just change them out to a 47 microfarad. You won't have any problems. Okay, there's also a capacitor on here that's a 200 microfarad. Another oddball, which is not a real easy capacitor to find. But if you do come across a 200 microfarad, do the best you can on eBay. You can find those capacitors in those values. Sometimes you might have to bridge or do some special wiring to make them work. But, 200 microfarad capacitors are unique capacitor values. You can find them. You can get them from China or Japan if you want to wait for them. Or you could bridge two 100 microfarad capacitors to make the value that you need. So the 200 microfarad capacitor is kind of a tricky one as well. But if you're having a problem and you can't find a 200 microfarad, bridge two 100 microfarads together and bridge those together to get the 200 microfarad value that you need. So I hope that answers the question to, I forgot who wrote me about that, who was looking for a 200 microfarad and didn't quite know what to do. You want to bridge two 100 microfarad capacitors to give you that 200 microfarad value that you need. It will work just fine. Also, if you are coming across these snap-on capacitors, these big, large, giant ones, of course, on this particular model I have, they're leaking. In the very bottom, the one is sort of blown out and the other one is starting to get kind of funky. So I want to change those out, but I don't have those large snap-on values that you would use the C-clips to clap them on, to clamp them to the power supply and all that crap. I don't have those particular types. I can get them if I want to buy them, but I'm not going to go that route. Today I'm going to bridge 1,000 microfarad capacitors in a smaller version by 50 volts. I'm going to bridge those using tubing to protect the leads, but to bridge them to the boards to replace the two mounted ones on the power supply itself. As you can see, once you solder and you bridge two capacitors of this value and you use heat shrink wrap tubing on the leads itself to keep them from touching anything, you can bridge them to the boards, bend them over, and they will work just fine. So today we're going to replace two 1,000 microfarad capacitors with 1,000 microfarad capacitors by 50 volts, which are in a small miniature or half the size actually of the big can type. And we're going to solder those in place and it will do the job just fine. So basically, if you have one of these older reel-to-reel video machines, you need to put brand new capacitors in the unit. There's a lot of tricks to it as far as, like I said, you might have to bridge a few to get a value you need, or you might have to, just eliminate a couple capacitors in the wiring and just bridge the values directly to the board like I did in the power supply. It works just fine. It replaces what you need and you're back, and you got, like I said, you're back up and running and the machine should power up, and those bad capacitors will work real good with these new replacements. So, I mean, if you have a problem with capacitors, there's always ways around it. Either you bridge values to make the value you need, or you use smaller versions and you can bridge them to the boards and just eliminate the big snap-on versions that, if you don't want to buy those or you can't find them, you could get around by just eliminating those completely. Also, you want to make sure you recap all the boards themselves. They have 10 microfarads, 47 microfarads, most of the time, and a lot of times they have 100 microfarads. It's a lot of capacitors. It's a little bit of work. It takes time to do this type of work, but if you replace all the capacitors on the unit, 9 out of 10 times the unit will power up and everything will start working properly. Video playback, motor playing back, everything should play back fine after you put brand new capacitors in the machine itself. Redo the whole machine. This is the #1 problem with vintage video equipment, especially vintage video gear like this. EIJ, skip fields, they all suffer from the same problem. So if you have any other problems with capacitors or any more questions, I hope this helped you out a little bit. Feel free to give me another email or drop me a question. I'll be glad to answer your questions as best I can. I hope you enjoyed this video.